Rain lashed against the windows, each droplet a tiny hammer against the glass, echoing the turmoil within John's mind. John, alone in his dimly lit apartment, felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He stared out at the storm, the chaotic weather mirroring the storm brewing inside him. He was tired, his mind weary from another long day at work, the endless cycle of tasks and deadlines draining his energy. The only sounds were the howling wind and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a steady reminder of time slipping away. The clock, a family heirloom that had seen better days, stood as a silent witness to his solitude. John poured himself a drink, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass, a ritual he had come to rely on. A feeble attempt to soothe his frayed nerves. The whiskey offered a momentary escape from his reality. He had always been a creature of habit, finding comfort in routine and predictability, a way to anchor himself in an unpredictable world. But lately, a sense of unease had crept into his life, a feeling that something was not quite right, a creeping shadow that followed him home each night, lurking in the corners of his mind. It started subtly, a feeling of being watched, a sensation that someone or something was always just out of sight, a prickle of unease on the back of his neck, a constant reminder that he was never truly alone. Now it was becoming harder to ignore, the feeling growing stronger with each passing day, a constant hum of anxiety that thrummed beneath the surface of his everyday existence, making it difficult to focus on anything else. John tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to stress and fatigue, convincing himself that it was all in his head. He had been working long hours, the demands of his job pushing him to his limits, leaving little time for rest or relaxation. But deep down, a knot of fear tightened in his stomach, a primal instinct whispering that something was amiss, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. A gnawing worry that refused to be silenced, no matter how much he tried to ignore it. He took a sip of his drink, the alcohol doing little to quell the rising tide of apprehension within him, the fear that something was lurking just beyond his understanding. John glanced at the old photographs on the mantel, memories of happier times, a stark contrast to his current state of mind, pictures of family gatherings, vacations and celebrations, moments frozen in time, reminding him of what he once had. But now those moments felt distant, almost like they belonged to someone else, leaving him feeling more isolated than ever. He picked up his phone, scrolling through messages and social media, searching for a distraction, a connection to the outside world. But the messages were few and far between, and the social media posts only served to highlight the gap between his life and the lives of others. An empty inbox, a stark reminder of his loneliness, the silence of his apartment echoing the silence in his heart. He picked up a book, hoping to lose himself in a story, to escape the reality of his situation, if only for a little while. The words on the page offered a temporary reprieve, a world where he could forget his troubles and immerse himself in someone else's life. But his tired eyes struggled to focus, the words blurring together, his mind unable to fully escape the grip of his anxiety. A heavy heart weighed him down, the burden of his worries pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He glanced at the clock, the minutes ticking by slowly, each second a reminder of his restless state. Sleep eluded him, his mind racing with thoughts and fears, the silence of the apartment amplifying his inner turmoil. John sat there, deep in thought, the storm outside a reflection of the storm within, wondering if he would ever find peace again. As he looked out the window, the rain continued to fall, each drop a reminder of the uncertainty that lay ahead. And the silent apartment around him offered no answers, only more questions. The phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound that shattered the silence. John jolted, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared at the phone, a sleek black device on his coffee table, its screen dark and lifeless. The insistent ringing seemed to echo in the quiet apartment, amplifying his unease. Who would call at this hour? John's mind raced, sifting through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He hesitated, a sudden wave of dizziness washing over him. The ringing continued, each shrill tone grating on his nerves. It felt personal, invasive, like an unwelcome intrusion into his sanctuary. Finally, he reached for the phone, his hand trembling slightly.
Hello?
Silence. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and rapid, echoing in his ear.
Hello?
He repeated, his voice louder this time, tinged with a hint of panic. Still, there was no response, only the faint crackle of static on the other end of the line. John hung up the phone, his anxiety growing with each passing moment. The call had been brief, but the voice on the other end was unsettling, a low murmur that sent chills down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He tried to rationalize the call, attributing it to a wrong number or a telemarketer. Yet, the tone of the voice, the way it lingered in his mind, made it hard to dismiss. He took a deep breath, attempting to calm his racing heart. But the unease was relentless. But the uneasy feeling persisted, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. It was as if his body was warning him of an impending danger, a threat that lurked just out of sight. He rubbed his temples, trying to dispel the growing sense of doom. He glanced at his watch, the luminous hands indicating it was well past midnight. The late hour only added to his anxiety, the darkness outside amplifying his fears. He wondered if he was overreacting, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain relentless in its assault on the windows. The weather seemed to mirror his inner turmoil, each gust of wind and clap of thunder echoing his growing panic. John paced his apartment, each step heavy with apprehension. The small space felt suffocating, the walls closing in on him. He tried to distract himself, but his mind kept returning to the call, the voice that seemed to whisper secrets only he could hear. He couldn't shake off the feeling that he was not alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains made him jump. He felt eyes on him, watching, waiting. The paranoia was overwhelming, a constant presence in the back of his mind. He imagined eyes peering through the darkness, unseen figures lurking just beyond his perception. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and changing shape, playing tricks on his mind. He knew it was irrational, but the fear was all too real. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible above the storm. It was a sound that sent shivers down his spine, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He strained to hear, his heart pounding in his chest. It seemed to come from the hallway, a faint rustling sound, like someone was just outside his door. He stared into the dimly lit corridor, his imagination running wild with possibilities. Was someone there? Or was it just his mind playing tricks on him? His breath caught in his throat. He froze, every muscle in his body tense, his senses on high alert. The silence was deafening, the anticipation unbearable. He felt like a prey being stalked, every instinct telling him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. He listened intently, his ears straining to identify the source of the sound. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a voice that seemed to call his name. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, his pulse racing. What was happening? Who was out there? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more terrifying than the last. John's mind raced back to his childhood, to a time when fear was a constant companion. It was a fear that clung to him like a shadow, always present, always lurking just out of sight. He could never quite shake it off, no matter how hard he tried. It was a fear that had shaped him, molded him into the person he was today. And now, as he stood there, lost in thought, that fear came rushing back, as vivid and as real as it had been all those years ago. He remembered the old house on the hill, the creaking floorboards, and the whispers that seemed to follow him from room to room. The house had always felt alive, as if it had a mind of its own. Every creak, every groan of the old wood seemed to be a message, a warning. The whispers were the worst, though. They were soft, almost inaudible, but they were always there, just at the edge of his hearing. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the house was trying to tell him something, something he was too young to understand. He remembered his sister, her terrified eyes, her hand clutching his as they huddled beneath the covers, listening to the sounds of their parents arguing downstairs. She was younger than him, and he had always felt a need to protect her. But in those moments he felt just as scared, just as helpless. The arguments were a nightly occurrence, a part of their routine. They would lie there, holding their breath, waiting for the yelling to stop. Sometimes it did, and they would fall asleep, exhausted. But other times it would escalate, and those were the nights he dreaded the most. One night the arguments had escalated, the yelling reaching a fever pitch. It was louder than usual, more intense. He could hear the anger in their voices, the frustration. It was as if all the pent-up emotions of the past weeks, months, maybe even years were finally boiling over. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. It was a night that would be etched into his memory forever. John had crept out of bed, drawn by a morbid curiosity. He knew he shouldn't, but he couldn't help himself. He had to see what was happening. He had to know. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He moved slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. The floorboards creaked under his weight and he winced, hoping his parents wouldn't hear. He peeked through a crack in the door, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw made his blood run cold. His father, a man he had always looked up to, was unrecognizable. His face was contorted in anger, his eyes wild. He was shouting, his voice hoarse from the effort. And then he saw it, his father's hand raised in a fist, ready to strike. It was a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He saw his father, his face contorted in anger, his hand raised in a fist. It was a moment frozen in time, a snapshot of pure rage. He wanted to scream, to run, to do something, anything, but he was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. He could only watch, helpless, as the scene unfolded before him. It was a moment that would change everything, and then everything went black. It was as if the world had stopped, as if time itself had come to a halt. He didn't know how long he stood there, in the darkness, his mind racing, his heart pounding. It could have been seconds, minutes, hours. All he knew was that when the lights came back on, everything had changed. John shook his head, trying to dispel the memory. It was a memory he had tried to bury, to forget. But it was always there, lurking in the shadows of his mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now it had. He could feel the fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness all over again. It was as if he was that scared little boy once more. He hadn't thought about that night in years. It was a part of his past he had tried to leave behind, to move on from. But some memories are too powerful, too deeply ingrained to ever truly forget. They shape us, define us, in ways we don't always understand. And now as he stood there, lost in thought, he realized that night had shaped him more than he had ever known. The incident was never spoken of, buried deep within the recesses of his mind. It was a secret he had carried with him, a burden he had borne alone. He had never told anyone, not even his sister. It was too painful, too raw. But now, as the memories came flooding back, he wondered if it was time to finally confront them, to face the demons of his past. But now, the fear, the uncertainty, it all came flooding back, as real and as terrifying as the day it happened. It was a flood of emotions, overwhelming and all-consuming. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, the lump forming in his throat. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment of truth. And as he stood there, lost in the memories of his past, he knew that he had a choice to make. He could continue to run from his past, to bury the memories deep within his mind, or he could face them, confront them, and finally, after all these years, find a way to heal.